Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. This is my 56th lesson in my series called A Journey to Faith, and tonight's lesson is called King Hezekiah's Religious Reforms and the Assyrian Empire. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the period of King Hezekiah's rule, who is our next descendant listed in the genealogy of Jesus. Unlike his wicked father King Ahaz, Hezekiah institutes comprehensive religious reforms and restores worship to the God of Israel. During his reign, the northern kingdom of Israel ceases to exist, and the Assyrian Empire is tested by alliances of rebellious smaller kingdoms desperate to free themselves from their oppressive rule. Extraordinarily, Hezekiah avoids the fate of the rebellious kingdoms when God asks his prophet Isaiah to remain nude for 3 years to demonstrate what will happen to all of those who disobey. The southern kingdom of Judah is eventually surrounded by the Assyrian Empire, and Hezekiah achieves some extraordinary engineering feats to prepare Jerusalem for what is to come. To learn what happens now, join us to understand this historical portion of the Bible and learn what God has to teach you from His Word. A Journey to Faith is a series based on the genealogy of Jesus, which you can find in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. The genealogy of Jesus has 40 descendants in total. They start with Abraham and finish with our Lord Jesus Christ. During the period of kings, we find that we are now up to King Hezekiah, and he is the 24th descendant on the genealogy of Jesus. We are finding now that we're getting towards the tail end of the period of kings in the Holy Bible. So sit back and relax. Don't forget to press that share button. Let's share the word of the Lord to as many people as possible. And if you do want to watch the video again, you can watch it on our YouTube channel or on our website at thejesusmovement.com.au. Let's begin. Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening to those who are with us here tonight. Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. Good evening to everybody who's joining us online. We have a wonderful lesson for you tonight. King Hezekiah has a wonderful story, but there's also some other stories that are going at the same time, which are equally interesting, including, as we'll discuss tonight, how the prophet Isaiah is called to be in the nude for 3 years. And so we're going to have a look at that story. King Hezekiah, as we've just mentioned in the beginning promo, is actually the son of King Ahaz, and he is the 12th king of Judah, and he was born in 739 BC. He will actually sit on the throne at the age of 25 and rule for 29 years from 1716 BC until his death in 687 BC. He will be succeeded by his son Manasseh, born by his wife Hephzibah. Now, before Hezekiah ascended the throne, the last wave of destruction to the former northern kingdom of Israel took place in 720 BC, led by Emperor Sargon II of Assyria, and later Hezekiah's reign of Judah. The city of Jerusalem will be invaded and blockaded in 701 BC by Sennacherib, the son of the Emperor Sargon. Now, although living through the suffering of his father's idolatrous reign, Hezekiah chooses to listen to Isaiah, son of Amoz, and Micah of Moresheth, who prophesied in Jerusalem. Once king, Hezekiah introduces comprehensive religious reforms and removes the worship of other gods from Jerusalem's house of the Lord, and throughout the land of Judah, Hezekiah essentially restores worship to the God of Israel. And so in last week's lesson, we'll just pop up the first screen here. And so in last week's lesson, we were having a look at King Ahaz, and during the reign of King Ahaz, we see that Hoshea came into rule as a puppet underneath the Assyrians, and it was the end of the northern kingdom of Israel altogether. Now, Ahaz was what would probably have to be the most evil king that we've actually met yet, because not only did he murder his own two sons by sacrificing them to fire, he actually closed the temple of Jerusalem, and he brought in an idol and put it into the temple in its place. And so he was a very evil king. And so we can ask the question, how does such an evil king have a son who then returns back to the Lord? And so the thing is, we see the scripture in the Bible that talks that there is a lamp that will always be held in Jerusalem amongst the kings, in order that the next generation can come, in order that the covenant that God made with Abraham would be fulfilled. And so Hezekiah's character is obviously clearly different to his father, and here he is here, and we find during the time of Hezekiah that we have specifically the prophets Micah and Isaiah who will be beside him. Now on the next screen I have a chart here. I'll come over this side. I have a chart here which follows the kings that we're talking about. So we're down to Hezekiah now here at the bottom, from 729 to 687 BC, as we've mentioned. If you look at the blue colour and we go across here, these are all of the kings and the emperors of the Assyrian Empire, and during his life he will start and have some experience with a short time with Shalmaneser, then Sargon II, and then Sennacherib, whom we'll actually introduce tonight into the story. So these are those names. We can see the alignment with the kings during the time of Judah. Okay, so there's three prophets that record the word of God in the book of Isaiah, the book of Hosea, and the book of Micah during the reign of King Hezekiah. So to really study King Hezekiah properly, we need to actually engage with the three books of those prophets at the same time. We also find in the book of Proverbs some of King Solomon's Proverbs. It says in Proverbs 25 verse 1, it says, are copied by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. And so we see that not only has he instituted religious reform into the land, but we find that he's starting to recopy the scripture in order for it to be used and given out throughout the land. And so this is part of his purpose. And the Jewish Talmud credits King Hezekiah with overseeing the actual compilation of the books of Isaiah, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. And so what they're saying is those four books of the Bible that we still know today are believed to be compiled. So all of the scriptures, all of the events, etc., are all compiled under the reign of King Hezekiah. So he has a very important place in the Bible, as well as an amazing story. So kicking off, in the first month of King Hezekiah's reign, he actually opened the doors of the temple of the Lord, which his father had closed. Like much else, they were in a state of disrepair, so he had them restored. He then had the priests and the Levites brought in and assembled them on the eastern side of the inner court before the temple. He addressed them. So our first scripture for tonight, if we go to 2 Chronicles, chapter 29, verses 5 to 11. So that's 2 Chronicles, chapter 29, verses 5 to 11. And we find that the reign of King Hezekiah is predominantly in the book of 2 Chronicles, also in the book of 2 Kings. And then, as I said, we have the composition that comes to add some depth and breadth to the story by reading the books of the prophets. So 2 Chronicles 29 verses 5 to 11, and it reads, listen to me, Levites, consecrate yourselves now and consecrate the temple of the Lord, the God of your fathers. Remove all defilement from the sanctuary. Our fathers were unfaithful, and they did evil in the eyes of the Lord our God and forsook him. They turned their faces away from the Lord's dwelling place and turned their backs on him. They also shut the doors of the portico and put out the lamps. They did not burn incense or present any burnt offerings at the sanctuary to the God of Israel. Therefore the anger of the Lord has fallen on Judah and Jerusalem. He has made them a dread and horror and scorn, as you can see with your own eyes. This is why our fathers have fallen by the sword, and why our sons and daughters and our wives are in captivity. Now I intend to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger will turn away from us. My sons, do not be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him and serve him, to minister before him, and to burn incense. And so this is a striking speech by King Hezekiah. He draws the Levites and the priesthood before him, and he basically says, we're going to reverse everything that was done that was evil before. We're going to reconsecrate you, we're going to reconsecrate the temple, and we're going to get back to worshipping our Lord God of Israel. And so I've just got a picture here, which we put up on previous lessons. And it's just an image of the temple of Jerusalem. And when we spoke about King Ahaz, some of the things that got changed was the bronze altar here, this massive altar where all of the sacrifices were made. It was actually removed from the courtyard, and it was actually put up around the northern side. And so you might remember they brought in a false idol in its place with an altar for their sacrifices, obviously not to God. This is the portico was closed or shut up, so this wasn't given any access whatsoever into the temple itself. They also talked about how the sea, so where the priests would wash, was actually taken off, and it was actually mounted not on these bulls but onto a stone wall. And it talked about how these panels were actually taken off the trolleys and removed as well. So there was quite a lot of desecration done. There was more than that, but just put up this picture to give you a bit of a picture. So he has to come back and he has to put this back together. They have to put this back together. They have to fix these up. They have to reopen the temple. All the implements and the tools were taken away, and they were used for the worship of false gods. And so he had a lot of work to do to reverse what his father had done. So this is an extraordinary testimony when we ponder, how does the son of such an evil father grow up righteous before the Lord? For each of us it bears witness that whilst we are subject to the evil or wrong of others, we are still able to break the bondage of sin and stand for the Lord. This also reveals that Jesus too, just like many of us, was not born from a bloodline of relatives who were perfect in every way. And as with him, it needn't hinder us. And so one of the issues we have today is that we claim descendancy as a birthright, and we say, so therefore, because of where we come from, that makes us who we are today. Well, there's a truth in that, obviously, in terms of our passage, but what we're talking about here is that when Jesus came, he was fulfilling a bloodline covenant which came from the time of Abraham. But the fact is that the path along the way wasn't pretty. There was lots of sin of almost every kind. And so when we have Jesus come to represent us to the Father, he has this same blood coursing through his veins. And so he is actually a person who knows what a sin nature is. The difference is he made those choices, those free will choices in which he didn't sin. And so when we receive a sin nature into us, that means it's there for all of us, but we too can turn away from sin and turn our lives around. And so this connection, when we look at descendancy, a lot of religion claims who they are today because of bloodlines. But when Jesus came, he didn't just come for his people, he came for all people from all nations, you and I. And so I've just got this wheel, which I will put up from time to time, that talks about sin. When people sin, there's a punishment from God. And then after a punishment, he doesn't want to leave them being punished. He wants to rescue them and restore them back into relationship again. And so what do we see here? We see that Ahaz, his father, sinned greatly. And he was punished greatly. And what happens? His son is born. His son grows up, and he becomes the person who rescues his people and turns away from sin, turns back to the Lord, restores the people of Judah back into a consecrated state with the Lord, reopens the temple, and begins the worship of God of Israel all over again. So the Levites the Bible tells us, got to work. Assembling their brothers, they consecrated themselves and purified the temple of the Lord. The priest purified the Lord's sanctuary and brought out into the courtyard everything unclean that they found in the temple. So I'll just put that picture back up again. So they got everything out and brought it out into the courtyard. The Levites then removed these things and took them to the Kidron Valley, which is on the eastern side, right next to the temple. And beginning on the first day of the first month of 716 BC, it took the priests and the Levites 16 days to consecrate both the grounds and the temple of the Lord itself. So King Hezekiah was in his palace, and when he was sent a message that the priests and the Levites had arrived in the Hall of Justice. So this is what the public room where people came to the king was from the time of Solomon. It was called the Hall of Justice. After greeting them, he sat on his throne, and they reported in 2 Chronicles chapter 29 again, verses 18 to 19, and said, "We have purified the entire temple of the Lord, the altar of burnt offering with all its utensils, and the table for setting out the consecrated bread, which is inside the temple, with all its articles. We have prepared and consecrated all the articles that King Ahaz removed in his unfaithfulness while he was king. They are now in front of the Lord's altar." And so the temple of the Lord was ready to be used again. So we can see the beginning of Hezekiah's reign. Instead of going into all of the politics and the other issues of the country, the first thing that he does, as we read in the Bible all the time, is he reinstitutes the altar, he reconsecrates the priesthood, and he gets back to worshipping the Lord as the first priority. Okay? And so we learn later on in the Babylonian exile how Zerubbabel leads his people back, and what's the first thing that they do? They build an altar to God first before they even bother with the temple, fixing the temple itself. Okay? Because the first priority is to bring back the worship to God again.
Do you think he first tear down the high places before he got to this, or do you think it was
Hezekiah?
Yeah.
No, this is his first priority.
Okay.
Was to take the idol out of the temple of Jerusalem. This is God's house. We need to take care of God's house first.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it would have been absolutely the first thing. And the scriptures relate it that this is the first task that was actually done. So King Hezekiah, he rose early the next morning and sent out messengers to gather the city officials together. Once together, he led them to the temple of the Lord. They took with them 7 bulls, 7 lambs, and 7 male goats. And it says in 2 Chronicles 29, verse 21, gave them as a sin offering for the kingdom, for the sanctuary, and for Judah. A much larger gathering of people from Jerusalem watched on, and after the animals were slaughtered for the sin offering, King Hezekiah placed the Levites in the temple of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres, and the priests with their trumpets, giving the order to sacrifice the burnt offering on the altar of God. In 2 Chronicles 29, verse 28 this time, it says, the whole assembly bowed in worship while the singers sang and the trumpeters played with the instruments of King David. So King David, when his reign was there, we know that he was an amazing musician and a poet and a writer, but he also was the person, when the temple was being prepared to be built, that would have been preparing all of these musical instruments to be used for worship as well. So after the offerings were finished, they all knelt down and worshipped, and then Hezekiah said to the full assembly in 2 Chronicles 29, verse 31, so moving to a couple of verses forward, you have now dedicated yourselves to the Lord. Come and bring sacrifices and thank offerings to the temple of the Lord. And so we see there's an order in what he's doing. First he fixes up the altar, he fixes up the temple, he consecrates the priesthood, and then he invites the officials, and then he invites the greater population. So he cleans house and organises everything necessary in order to take his people forward in a new direction once again. So the assembly brought forward 70 bulls, it says, 100 rams and 200 male lambs for burnt offerings, and 600 bulls with 3,000 sheep and great sacrifices. This is listed in verses 32 and 33 of 2 Chronicles 29. And so we see many more animals now being slaughtered for this purpose. After the abundance of these burnt offerings, fat of the fellowship offerings and drink offerings, the use of the temple of the Lord was again established, and King Hezekiah celebrated with his people. So I want to ask you the question, why do you think he had people bring offerings, not just the officials or not just what he actually put on the table, so to speak? He had people bring the offerings. Why do you think he called them to bring offerings?
Sins.
Right, they were for the purposes of sin. What else was he doing though? He was completely changing society.
So
he was
bringing them back to the Lord.
Right. And so he was using the ordinances that God gave to them to actually bring them all back so that all of them would come before the Lord together as a society and actually practice what God ordained them to do. And so by so doing, he was basically saying all those other things that you've been doing, all those things that you've been sacrificing to, now we're back to worship of our Lord, of God of Israel. And so it's a very important step to do. So now there was no ruler at this point in time, as we mentioned in the beginning, over the remnant of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. So King Hezekiah decided that he would send word throughout all of Israel and Judah. So he was the king of Judah, but he knew obviously that there were still those in the northern kingdom, in the 10 different tribes, that was still remaining. And we explored that in the previous weeks where we talked about the 10 stumps. So they said that 1 in 10 people would remain in the 10 tribes of Israel. So there's still a large quantity of people who are still worshipping the Lord even despite what happened. And so it says that he went from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south to invite them once again to come to the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover in the second month. And so he's taken care of his people and his society first, and now he's reaching out to those who've been overcome by the Assyrians in the north. Now the Passover is normally celebrated in the month of Aviv or Nisan, in the first month of the Hebrew calendar year, which is when the temple was reopened. So that's when Hezekiah reopened the temple. But because there were not enough consecrated priests and all the people had not assembled in Jerusalem, King Hezekiah sought to celebrate Passover in the second month, which is called Iyar or Ziv. Now these months vary because of the languages that they were written in. Some of them are known as Babylonian months and some of them are Hebrew months. So there's these two different names. So they did this to immediately institute the necessary religious reforms to bring his people back to worship the God of Israel by festival, by ordinance, by offering and by sacrifice. So we read from 2 Chronicles again, this time chapter 30, and look at verses 10 to 12. It says the couriers, so he sent out couriers, went from town to town in Ephraim and Manasseh as far as Zebulun, but the people scorned and ridiculed them. So I'm just going to pop up a map before I go any further because of these names, so you can get an idea. So it says the couriers went from town to town through Ephraim and Manasseh. So we've got west and east Manasseh. So they would have obviously gone up through here first. Now, it goes on to say that nevertheless some men of Asher, Manasseh and Zebulun humbled themselves and went to Jerusalem. So Asher and Zebulun, so there's Asher up here, and here is Zebulun, the tribe of Zebulun here. And so this gives us a nice clear picture of where they were coming from. They went to Jerusalem. Also in Judah, the hand of God was on the people to give them the unity of mind to carry out what the king and his officials had ordered, following the word of the Lord. So in other words, he reached out and he had some success. Some people came from those northern kingdoms. From the northern kingdom, former kingdom. On the 14th day of the second month, the Passover lamb was slaughtered and the feast of unleavened bread was celebrated for 7 days with great rejoicing. Hezekiah encouraged the Levites as they once again came to serve the Lord. In fact, all went so well that they celebrated for another 7 days. So we read now from 2 Chronicles chapter 30 again, but verses 26 to 27. It says, "There was great joy in Jerusalem, for since the days of Solomon, son of King of Israel, David, king of Israel, There had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. The priests and the Levites stood to bless the people, and God heard them, for their prayer reached heaven, his holy dwelling place. And so we get a picture that this was a big deal. This was as big as it was in the time of King David. So when the celebrations ended, the Israelites went out to the towns of Judah to intentionally, so this answers our earlier question, to intentionally wipe out idolatry and destroy the many places of worship to other gods. They smashed sacred stones and cut down Asherah poles carved with the image of the goddess worshipped for provision of fresh water and fertility. They destroyed the high places and the altars, not just in the tribal territories of Judah and Benjamin, but also through Ephraim and Manasseh, before each of them returned to their own towns and properties. So again, there's those four. So we're talking Manasseh, Ephraim, the tribe of Benjamin, and of course in Judah. So these are the regions where they were all being destroyed, which tells you that there was other areas that they weren't destroyed, but they were outside of the kingdom of Judah.
One of the interesting things that they said which the altars destroyed was the bronze serpents by Moses.
I'm going to come to that. Very good.
Sorry.
No, very good. You're on the ball.
Yeah.
Because it became an idol as well.
Yeah.
Very good. So Hezekiah even decided to break into pieces, the very next sentence I'm going to speak, the bronze stake on a pole forged to heal God's people who suffered from snakebite when they were wandering in the wilderness. And we read about that in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verses 4 to 9. So, of course, I just happened to have a picture of this. So this is an illustration I used earlier in the lessons. So this post was put up with a crossbar, and this bronze snake was on there. The people were being bitten by snakes, and of course the Lord told them that if they were to come to this and to worship and pray to God and to ask for forgiveness, that their snake bites would be healed, and so they were. The problem is when things like that happen, historically, they go in the future and everyone thinks that this thing itself has a power. And unfortunately, the people in the time of Ahaz and many of the generations before came to a point where they actually began to worship it itself. It says the people of Judah had worshipped it as an idol, and in 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 4, it says they had been burning incense to it. So in other words, this was a real ritual that they had. It wasn't a random thing. Now Hezekiah actually gave it a name. He contemptuously called it Nehushtan, which is Nehushtan, Nehushtan. And it actually means a brazen thing, a mere piece of brass to deliver his people from their infatuation and impress upon them that it was worthless. Now we talked about the golden calves and how they're considered a graven image. Okay, so that means they're cast. So this thing too is they're saying it's brazen, it's actually a cast object, and so he's actually using this terminology to say the same thing. And so he actually destroys this object so people would stop worshipping it. So having led his people back to worship the God of Israel, between the 3rd and 7th month of 716 BC, Hezekiah went about organising the priesthood. So you can see we're in 3 months. He's busy. Like this is a lot going on for 3 months. So he's absolutely flat out turning everything around. So the priests and Levites were assigned divisions according to their duties, and the people of Jerusalem, and Judah began to bring a portion of their first fruits. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verse 5, it says, grain, new wine, oil and honey, and all that the fields produced. And in 2 Chronicles 31 verse 6, the next verse, it says, a tithe of their herds and flocks, and a tithe of the holy things dedicated to the Lord their God. And so what was happening here is that the institution of blessing the people through the priesthood, but also the people actually getting the idea that they provided everything from God, meant that they were obliged to tithe this back to the priesthood. And so what better way to reinstitute into society that they worship the God of Israel, and that the priesthood are the representatives of the Lord in their society, and so they institute this practice whereby everyone gets back into this routine of giving a portion of everything that they do as if they were giving it back to God. And so this completely turns society around. So much came in that Hezekiah ordered the preparation of the storerooms in the temple of the Lord to hold all that the priests and Levites received. A portion of these tithes delivered to the temple was also distributed to the priestly descendants of Aaron. Now in 2 Chronicles chapter 31 verse 19 it says, "They lived on the farms given to their predecessors surrounding the 13 priestly towns throughout the kingdom of Judah." You may remember in the past I've told you there was 40 priestly towns throughout the United Kingdom of Israel. So in Judah itself, this scripture tells us that 13 of those were located in Judah. So the Levites who were descendants, in Joshua chapter 21 verse 4, so it's a past reference, it says, "The Levites who were descendants of Aaron the priest were allotted 13 towns from the tribe of Judah, Simeon and Benjamin." And so when we have a look at that, when we have a look at this map, again we had Simeon, Judah and Benjamin. So Simeon is no longer, this is a tribe we spoke about. It was given in this region in the middle of Judah. It's a fairly barren region. The Simeonites assimilated not just throughout Judah but through the other tribes of Israel, and so they're not an independent tribe, if you will, or territory on their own. It's now just part of Judah. But this scripture is denoting the fact that when the priestly cities were put into place, that some of them were in Simeon as well as Judah as well as Benjamin. And so this was the original setup when Joshua first entered the land of Canaan. So Hezekiah had established himself, and he was both great and good. Judah never had another king like him, the Bible tells us. He was successful in everything he did because the Lord was with him. So in 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 6, so 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 6, we're going to flip back and forth between the two books. It says, "He held fast to the Lord and did not cease to follow him. He kept the commands the Lord had given to Moses." And so we're talking about not the 10 commandments, we're talking about the 613 commandments, because to fulfill all of those it was necessary to have the temple of Jerusalem dedicated and up and running to the Lord, because many of the commandments were around those issues, not just the laws in terms of thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery and so on. And so there was all of those laws as well. Okay, so we're going to change speed now. So we just sort of give that introduction about what King Hezekiah himself did. So we're going to switch over and we're going to have a look at a political situation that was happening throughout the region in the time. And so in 715 BC, the Medes, and I mentioned these before, a people from the Iranian plateau revolted against Assyria under the reign of Emperor Sargon II. And in 1714 BC, in what is known as the Ashdod Rebellion, the city of Ashdod withheld its tribute from Assyria, and the other Philistine towns joined in the rebellion. And so I'm going to bring you up to speed with this. So here is Ashdod. So there was a rebellion in Ashdod. Ashdod was actually part of the ancient Philistia, which means this was all Philistine territory. And so there was a rebellion organised here. Okay. Now they talk about the Medes. Oops, I have to go forward another one. Sorry. So I've put up one of these maps that I've created because the picture's getting pretty big now. It's hard just to speak about this region where most of our maps are normally from. And so here is what represents Assyria, all of this yellow area here. So they've conquered from the Persian Gulf, so they have access to the Persian Gulf here, the Red Sea over here, the Mediterranean Sea, access to the Black Sea, so they have lots of ports in order to trade from for starters. Assyria had conquered all of these regions, and you can see they're quite considerable. Last week we spoke about how they took out Syria. and they also took out the other regions on the other side of Israel. So they took out the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites. They took out the northern kingdom of Israel. They took out Aram Damascus, which is the regions of Syria here. And so they conquered all of these areas. And so this scripture here is now talking about the Medes. So this is Media. And the Medes are one of a composite who will become part of the Persian Empire as we go forwards now. So there was Media, and the Persia is what's known as this area, which is called Persis in the ancient tongue. So these two areas at a future point will come together and form a new empire. So we find here with Assyria, we see here that there's conflict with the Assyrians on this side. And so in this particular rebellion that they're talking about, they're saying that Upper Egypt, ruled by a Cushite pharaoh, had an interest in the rebellion as they sought to expand control further north, and so many of the Assyrian vassals turned to them for help. So we can see, like all great empires, all of those on the boundaries or who have been affected by them are suddenly wanting to push them back and to gain more power or independence for themselves once again. But what this tells us is it's not just happening in one location, it's happening on this front, it's also happening on this front, and there's also some activity in here as well. So according to Assyrian documentation, the kingdom of Judah, ruled by Hezekiah, along with Edom and Moab, were invited to participate in this rebellion. So this is outside of the Bible now. This is historical documentation. No doubt, if that's the case, King Hezekiah, who was ruling at the time, must have been very tempted to form an alliance with the others, and may have even discussed the possibility with Egypt. For the prophet Isaiah mentions that ambassadors from Upper Egypt, and it says in his scripture, the land of whirring wings. Now, whirring wings means locust. That's the name that they use for locusts. So it says the land of whirring wings along the rivers of Cush. Now, the rivers of Cush are classed as the Upper Nile River. And so we haven't got the full... Oh, yes, we do. So this is the Nile. And so when we talk about the lower kingdom, it's here because it's lower in altitude. The water flows from the top down into the Mediterranean. And so we're talking about this region up here, which is what was known as Cush. So these were the Ethiopians. And so they were looking to push forward. So this is saying Prophet Isaiah mentions that ambassadors from Upper Egypt, the land of whirring wings along the rivers of Cush, were sent. And it says in Isaiah chapter 18, verses 1 to 2, and we're going to look at a longer scripture from Isaiah 20 in a moment. So if you want to turn to the book of Isaiah, go to chapter 18, verses 1 to 2 to start off. And it says that the ambassadors from the land of whirring wings along the rivers of Cush were sent as envoys by sea in papyrus boats over the water. Okay, so that means into the Mediterranean in order to come up to Ashdod, because Ashdod, of course, is over here in the Mediterranean. So they would have come out the Nile up over to here. So the desire for freedom from Assyria at this point in time was strong. But the Lord used the prophet Isaiah to strongly oppose any form of alliance with Upper Egypt. The Lord, and this is something we can have a giggle about and you might not be able to fathom, but the Lord had Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, walk around naked and barefoot to demonstrate what was going to happen to Egypt and Cush. So in other words, the Lord is saying that this was going to happen, this rebellion, and that those who came up from this region here were going to end up naked and barefoot. And so to find out what's going on here, we're going to go to Isaiah chapter 20 and read from verses 1 to 6. So Isaiah 20 verses 1 to 6. It says, "In the year that the supreme commander sent by Sargon, king of Assyria," and I have a picture of Sargon, we put this up last week. So this is a sculpture of him from ancient Assyria. In the year that supreme commander sent by Sargon, king of Assyria, came to Ashdod and attacked and captured it. At that time the Lord spoke through Isaiah, son of Amoz. He said to him, "Take off the sackcloth from your body and the sandals from your feet." And he did so, going around stripped and barefoot. Then the Lord said, "Just as my servant Isaiah has gone stripped and barefoot for 3 years, as a sign and portent against Egypt and Cush, so the king of Assyria will lead away stripped and barefoot the Egyptian captives and Cushite exiles, young and old," and then it says very gleefully, "with buttocks bared." And so we're talking about full nudity here. To Egypt's shame. Those who trusted in Cush and boasted in Egypt will be afraid and put to shame. In that day, the people who live on this coast will say, "See what has happened to those we relied on, those we fled to for help and deliverance from the king of Assyria. How then can we escape?" And so we have this extraordinary picture in our mind of Isaiah the prophet, a mature man, running around with no clothes on for 3 years, and he's there to serve the Lord with his king Hezekiah. So I have these pictures in my mind of King Hezekiah sitting in the hall of justice in his palace, and a very nude Isaiah coming in and saying whatever he had to say. And so you could just imagine he'd be just like, it's an extraordinary story. For me, I would like to challenge you. Yeah. If the Lord said to you, "I want you to go nude for 3 years to demonstrate what's going to happen to some people in 3 years' time," how do you think you would go? Yeah, it would be a very challenging thing, wouldn't it? And so we see Isaiah as this incredible prophet in the Bible. Incredible prophet. Lived for a long time, served so many kings, served the Lord perfectly. Right? He had a vision. He saw and spoke with Jesus. And this very man, he's been called to run around with his clothes not on for 3 years. And so I can't help but chuckle that the Lord must have a sense of humour as well.
But also Hezekiah listened to him.
Correct.
He could have been labelled as crazy, but
yes.
Hezekiah kept on listening to him,
right.
Which is amazing.
And so this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because when we read the story in Kings or Chronicles, we don't get any of this. No. Right? We only get this through the book of Isaiah. And so if we don't read the Bible and integrate the different books with what's happening, we don't see the whole picture of what was going on. And so extraordinarily, in 711 BC, and this is what's quite amazing about this story for us today, is that history actually records that the Philistine city of Ashdod, who had withheld its tribute for 3 years from Assyria, so this is the reason why Assyria attacked, because they actually withheld their taxes for 3 years. And so Isaiah basically is running around the nude for 3 years while this city or town of Ashdod was not paying their taxes. And it says that they were attacked and captured. So the prophet Isaiah must have been mightily relieved to be allowed to put his clothes back on at that point in time. The Holy Bible doesn't mention Hezekiah's decision, but it is clear he must have took notice of the long-suffering, nude Isaiah, for he didn't participate in the revolt. And when Emperor Sargon II sent his commander with the army to crush the rebellion, the kingdom of Judah did not suffer any reprisal. And so it was during the rest of the reign of Emperor Sargon II of Assyria that Hezekiah remained a vassal and paid the annual tribute. And so we have to understand at this point in time, because of King Ahaz, he was evil, the Lord sent the Assyrians against them and turned them into a vassal state, which means that they were independent in the sense that they could govern their own nation. They were free to practice their religion. However, they were not free as a people. They were obliged to pay taxes to the empire. And so this is that story. So the outcome of this was that the Lord knew what was going to happen before it happened. He used this prophet to warn Hezekiah, and Hezekiah didn't join in a rebellion, and as a consequence their country didn't get flattened or razed to the ground as the northern kingdom of Israel was. And so because he was a good king and he paid his taxes, he didn't have a problem. Remember what Jesus said to the people in his day. He said, render your taxes to Caesar.
Yeah.
So in other words, don't worry about it. Pay your taxes to the master of the land. It's not worth fighting against that, losing your life or anything else. So he said you must pay your taxes. And so we see here that Hezekiah was wise enough to put his people first and his belief and faith in God and the worship of God first, and not place paying taxes to the Assyrians as his first priority. Because of course paying taxes is a symptom of the commercial activity of a country. It is about money and about earthly power, not about godly power. And so Hezekiah's lesson for us is quite powerful. So moving on, in 714 to 713 BC, the main Assyrian army is actually occupied in the east and overcomes the kingdom of Tubal, as it's known, and turns it into an Assyrian province. Now I'll just put this this map up again for reference behind me. So to the east, so that's on this side. So we've got this kingdom of Tubal. It says in 1713 BC, Emperor Sargon received the submission of 45 Median city chiefs that he incorporated into 34 districts of Medes. And in 712 BC, the new Hittite state of Kamuhu is sacked in a turn of events. The newly created province of Tubal rebels and successfully repels the Assyrians in 711 BC. So we've got this toing and froing going on the eastern side of the boundaries of the Assyrian Empire. So people are being overtaken and then they're pushing back. It says 45 Median city chiefs. So this is Media over here. And so obviously they were coming out into this land and then they were trying to push them back again. So Emperor Sargon again succeeds when he drives a fellow called Marduk Apla Edina. Now he's the person in the Bible who's known as Merodach Baladan, and he is on the throne of Babylonia. And so we have Babylonia here. The capital, of course, is Babylon. Okay, so this is part of the Assyrian Empire at this point in time. But what we're starting to hear is we're starting to hear about the future Persian Empire, and we're starting to hear a bit about the Babylonian challenges in here as well. And so these names are going to keep coming up, and then the history is going to tell us, and the Bible is going to tell us that there's a shift in power that comes. So again, Merodach Baladan in the Bible, and so he drives him from the throne in Babylonia into the extreme south to an area covered in marshes and impossible to control. He then ruled Babylonia himself. So if you understand that this is actually a delta, much like the delta of the Nile. And so in this region here, where the water actually meets the Persian Gulf, it's not as big as this one, but it actually divides up and it forms marshy territory. And so it becomes a good place for people to hide from an enemy. And so it says that the rulers and their people, they would escape down to here and they would hide, and then the Assyrians would leave them alone and go away again. So this is the first instance that we read about this in history, and this is tied to these events that are happening. So it is at this point in history we see a shift in the fortunes of Babylonia. Up to this point in time, whether an independent or a vassal kingdom, Babylonia had been ruled by a mixture of Kassite, Babylonian and Chaldean kings. And so we know from the Bible that it talks about the Chaldeans. Okay, so these people are all from different regions in southern Iraq today, but they're they're living in this region together. But they had different kings because kingdoms in those days were city-states, and so they were like a city with its fortress, with its king and its surrounding lands. And so they all coexisted in that region together. So now a new dynasty of kings emerged, and it says that they were only Chaldean. They contested the rule of Assyria and changed kings rapidly. When they usurped the throne, the Assyrians would attempt to attack them, only to find that the Chaldean kings and their armies would flee into the extreme south, back into the marshes, and they were impossible to control with traditional military tactics. Every time the Assyrian Empire was drawn away from Babylonia to quell a revolt or invade another territory, the Chaldean king would race back up to Babylonia and take over the city again. And so you can imagine this toing and froing and this instability that it was causing. So this is the very formation of the beginning of the Babylonian Empire. When we move to 705 BC, Emperor Sargon II was killed in battle. So this emperor we've been following along was killed in battle attempting to reconquer this place known as Tabal, which provided the opportunity to rebel against Assyria. Several vassal nations took this opportunity as a reality. Amongst them were a people known as the Hagaranu, Hagaranu. So this people, they believe that they're actually descendants of Ishmael's mother, Hagar, the Hagaranu. And then there was the Nabatu, which is believed to be the descendants of Nebaioth, which is actually the second son of Ishmael. Okay, so these people form these early tribes. And then we also have the Kedarites, which are the descendants of Ishmael. Nebaioth is the first son, and the Kedarites are the descendants of Ishmael's second son, who's known as Kedar. So we have Hagar, the mother, we have Ishmael, we have the first and second sons, and they all form tribes, which seems quite reasonable. They were forced to move out, you might remember, in the time of Abraham, and so they would have become people who settled in different regions as each of their tribes expanded. And it says that they all fled into the Arabian desert and avoided being conquered. And so the Arabian desert, these tribes, it's believed, were settled around this sort of region, what's in today's Jordan. But of course, with the Assyrians coming in, they would have been pushed out. So we know this is Saudi Arabia today, but what's called the Syro-Arabian desert was actually all of this region. So we've got the two river systems up here, the Euphrates, and then we've got the Tigris rivers. So it's fertile in between these two rivers. But between the Euphrates River all the way across to the Jordan River, most of this is really arid desert. Okay? And so these tribes would exist in these regions. So you can imagine, this is the stuff of movies, isn't it? They would have been on camels, they would have been wearing their turbans, they would have been moving all of the time to get water and hunting. And so they would have lived this quite evasive lifestyle. And we have to understand, in these days, the Assyrians fought what we call a pitched battle, which means they would assemble all of their troops in an arena of war, and they would come against an enemy in a set arena. Whereas what we're hearing here through this story is that we've got hit and runs happening by the Chaldean kings up and down to Babylon. They're going in and out, back and forth to Media, and now these people came out of here and they're going back and forth into here. And so we have all of this region here where the Assyrians aren't in complete control. These people are trying to break them down and to remove their authority and power over them. Now, the son of Emperor Sargon is called Sennacherib, beg your pardon. And so I've just put up this chart with a little bit more information. I've given you a wider spread. So we're talking about Hezekiah. This is Sennacherib. So he came to power in 705 BC. And so this is now the king that we're talking about. Over here on this side of the chart, I'll just turn around. You can see here that there's history documents these Kedarite kingdom. It's said to have started in 850 BC under this name of Gindabu. Now, Gindabu was actually a Kedarite king who killed King Ahab of Israel in 848 BC. So there's a connection that goes all the way back to this time. And so all of these rulers here, they don't have any names for them in history. They document there was a king, but they don't date them and they don't put names to them. But they're given a period of time, obviously, between this documented event and this documented queen, who ruled from 750 BC. So when we're looking at Sennacherib and we're talking about 705 BC, then we're finding ourselves down in this region here where the Kedarites were actually ruled by a queen called Yati. So we have this Kedarite influence in the desert, and then we have the Assyrians that we're talking about over here, and then down here in 629 BC we'll find the beginning of the Babylonian kingdom, which happens in 629 BC. So we're not quite there yet, but we're seeing right now that the Babylonians are starting to chip away and come into the picture. And these people who are the descendants of Ishmael are chipping away in the desert and having an impact as well. I've just got a picture for you here as part of our title picture. This is Sennacherib, keep mispronouncing it. So he's actually on his horse there with the arrow. So this is a relief, as they're called. And so this was a relief, I believe, in Nineveh. And so this is an Assyrian picture of their own king, obviously showing his prowess with the bow arrow and the horse as a mounted archer. Okay, so we're starting to see in the Bible, we've got all of these other things going on. Whilst Hezekiah is in his kingdom reinstituting, he's actually submitted to all of this. There was a rebellion in Ashdod he didn't participate in, and so we can see there's lots going on. Okay, now Hezekiah sent ambassadors to Egypt to ask for help, but the prophet Isaiah, as we mentioned, had warned him not to rebel against Assyria and not to form an alliance with Egypt, for it would only bring disaster on Judah. So if we go to Isaiah again, the book of Isaiah, chapter 30 this time, verses 1 to 3, it says, "Woe to the obstinate children, declares the Lord, to those who carry out plans that are not mine, forming an alliance, but not by my spirit, heaping sin upon sin, who go down to Egypt without consulting me, who look for help to Pharaoh's protection, to Egypt's shade for refuge, but Pharaoh's protection will be to your shame. Egypt's shade will bring you disgrace." Excuse me one moment. So we find here that Hezekiah, who up to this point had stayed out of the rebellion and had reinstituted and reformed the worship to God in the kingdom of Judah, suddenly he's made a mistake. The prophet Isaiah here reveals that he's taking actions without the Lord's blessing. He's doing this independently, and so it's being talked about as a sin. And so what he's saying here, if we were to take a word from this, is that we should consult with the Lord before we make some of these mighty decisions in our life, in order to make sure that it's aligned with his will. And so you've got to realise, especially in this situation, that the reason the kingdom of Judah was actually being suppressed by the Assyrians was because the Lord brought them against them and gave them power. The Bible tells us this. And so suddenly if he starts to take actions against that, then he's basically going against the will of God himself. And so Isaiah says to him that this is no good. So in Hezekiah's 14th year of reign, with Emperor Sennacherib of Assyria on his way to invade the kingdom of Judah and his rebelling neighbours, Hezekiah relied on the Egyptians to come to his aid, but they did not come. Now there's references to that in 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 21 to 24. So 2 Kings 18, verses 21 to 24. And it's also spoken about by the prophet Isaiah in the book of Isaiah, chapter 36, verse 9. So once again, as a consequence of Hezekiah's actions to form an alliance and to get help against the will of God, we find that the Assyrians are now going to come and surround the kingdom of Judah and any of his neighbours who are going to rebel. So Hezekiah realised it was only to be a matter of time before Emperor Sennacherib invaded the kingdom of Judah and sought to attack Jerusalem itself. So he set about preparing his city for the inevitable siege that would come. So he understood clearly that this wasn't going to go well. And we go now into a very interesting story, and we go into something which is something when we go to Israel today that we can visit and see for ourselves. So the Bible tells us he blocked the flow of water from the Gihon spring outside the city walls. He repaired several broken sections of wall and built towers on top of the wall for defence. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32 verse 5 it says, he built another wall outside that one and reinforced the supporting terraces of the city of David. He also made large numbers of weapons and shields. And so I'm going to put up my next picture for you. And this is the new outer wall that Hezekiah built. And so when you go to the Western Wailing Wall today in Jerusalem, if you walk up through the middle, if you want to call it through the middle of the city, to the Armenian Quarter, which is where the Tower of David and the Jaffa Gate is, you actually walk across this walkway which you can see across the top. And in the middle there's this excavated section in which there is this wall. When you're on top walking around, you could literally walk past it and miss it. But it's such a significant thing that you can see there's actually a plaque on the wall here that defines what it is. And so this is Hezekiah's wall, and it was actually a new wall that was built in addition. Apparently it was discovered in the 1970s during an archaeological dig. The Broad Wall, as it's called, is an ancient defensive wall in Jerusalem's old city dated to Hezekiah's reign. A massive wall measuring 7 metres thick and unbroken length of 65 metres long has been uncovered, with several sections conserved to a height of 3.3 metres. And so you can see it goes under the ground, so you can't see all of it when you go there because it's all fenced off, but there's one exposed section for the public to be able to witness. However, it is 65 metres that they've uncovered. It is believed that the city in this period was limited to the fortified narrow hill running to the south of the Temple Mount, known as the City of David. This archaeological discovery demonstrated that by the late 8th century BC that the city had expanded to include the hill to the west of the Temple Mount. Now bear with me, I'm going to put up a wonderful picture which will show you how all this works in a moment. When we read from Isaiah chapter 22 verses 9 to 10, it says that stone was needed for the construction of the walls and the aqueduct. So in other words, they needed to bring this water inside the city wall. So the point of all of this is that where the water came out was outside of the city fortifications. And so if they were going to be surrounded by the Assyrians, they needed to be able to bring water inside the city, and preferably they wanted to stop supplying water to their enemy, and so they built a new wall to bring the water inside. So this scripture says, "You saw that the city of David had many breaches in its defences. You stored up water in the lower pool. You counted the buildings in Jerusalem and tore down houses to strengthen the wall. You built a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool." Does anyone know what this old pool is? It's a pool that's spoken about in the time of Jesus. And in fact, we've just had in the last few months a discovery of the new underground, as it is today, walkway or road that goes from this pool up through the city of David to the Temple Mount. It's the original road that goes through that Jesus would have walked on, and it's believed that there's a platform in there with steps where people would speak to the public, and they actually believe that this was the very place where Peter spoke to the 3,000 people when they spoke in tongues on the day of Pentecost. And the Siloam pool, because they washed and consecrated themselves first, is the only pool that's big enough in Jerusalem to actually fulfill that role. That's outside of the temple. And so they pretty much have an idea, as of this recent discovery, that there's this very exciting understanding of exactly where all of these things were now. And so this pool is known as the Siloam pool, Siloam. Now the ancient city of Jerusalem is actually on a mountain and is naturally defensible from all sides. Unfortunately, its major source of fresh water, which is called the Gihon Spring, Gihon, is on the cliffside overlooking the Kidron Valley. This is a major military weakness, for although the city walls are high enough to be defensible, the supply of fresh water is outside in the case of a siege. Hezekiah, fearful of the pending Assyrian siege, blocked the spring's water outside the city and diverted it through a channel into the Siloam pool. Now this isn't unusual. In the ancient cities, the water was kept outside the wall because of people had livestock. They had to be able to water and fetch water for their livestock and for their farms. And so the water wasn't always inside. And so in this case, it would have been great when there's no war, but of course when war comes, they need to protect themselves and have water inside. And so I'm going to put up this wonderful illustration. So up here at the top, we have the Temple of Jerusalem. This, on this side here, is the royal quarters of Hezekiah's palace, so it's right next door here. These are the outer walls that came down, and you can see what happened. They pushed the wall out, and they built new fortifications and towers, as it says, and they built this additional wall around here. So this is the broad wall, Hezekiah's wall that he built. Now what they found is where the Gihon spring was, in order for water to come through what is igneous rock, so volcanic rock, meaning that it's very hard and it's not porous, which is what contains it, they found that there was a fissure, obviously, for that water to pass through. So what they did is they followed this fissure and carved a tunnel. And so when you see this picture with this cutout with this wiggly line, the tunnel doesn't go in a straight line, and in fact follows the fault line in the actual rock. And so this pool here is the Siloam pool. They had to bring the water into a location where, of course, it went downhill in order to fill up a pool for them to use. This is an extraordinary engineering feat, and apparently to this very day they're scratching their head as to how they did it. Because when you read the Bible, it talks to them, cutting it with picks. So this is igneous rock. I understand, I think it's about 533 metres long. Yeah, 533 metres of rock. And they cut this tunnel all the way through here. So they brought it inside the wall, cut off the water from the outside, built this, and then brought the water down to the Siloam pool. And so it's quite an extraordinary feat. This is the original city of David here. And then it grew, and it grew, and then they added on these other walls. So you can see this wall that goes down here. That's because that was the original city of David. And so we have this space down here. So going forwards from there, here's a couple of pictures for you. And so here we have a picture of a person who's standing almost at the outside entrance of where the wall comes, of where the wall used to be, and you can see the light outside. So you can see the water flowing at the bottom. You can see the sheer height of this rock that they cut through. They did it by hand. You just can't fathom this. Another picture of this shows, depending on the flow of water with spring, etc., it'll increase and subside, and so you can see this water's moving along at a fair old pace. But it's a long tunnel, so without artificial light in there, it's actually pitch black, and so no one would know it's there. And it flows out, and it comes to the outside wall, and at the outside wall there's a plaque, and it's called Siloam's inscription. It's in Istanbul in Turkey today. Because of the Ottoman Empire, they found this. This plaque was near the opening of the actual wall. And so obviously I'd like to do a little bit of research, and I found what the inscription actually says, or what that portion that they have. And it begins, when the tunnel was driven through, and this was the way in which it was cut through. And it reads, while the quarrymen were still, and they have a missing word, and then they say axes, so whatever their picks or metal heads were, they call them axes, each man towards his fellow, and while there were still 3 cubits to be cut through, there was heard the voice of a man calling to his fellow. So this is all written on this inscription. For there was an overlap in the rock on the right and on the left, and when the tunnel was driven through, the quarrymen hewed the rock, each man towards his fellow, axe against axe, and the water flowed from the spring toward the reservoir for 1,200 cubits, and the height of the rock above the heads of the quarrymen was 100 cubits. And so 1,200 cubits, we're told it's 533 metres. So if the height of the rock above the heads of the quarrymen was 100 cubits, then we're talking about an extremely high cut, and you can see that in those pictures. So obviously they're allowing for the volume of water that would need to pass through there without creating a pressure where it comes spurting out the other end. And so this is classed as an incredible feat done by hand in these ancient times. And so if you translate that, what was the fear of Hezekiah and his people to complete an engineering feat like that to bring the water inside? They must have known they were in serious trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, why? That's an extraordinary task, even under normal terms.
Yeah.
But this is what they actually achieved. So it was cut through 533 metres of rock to provide Jerusalem underground access to the water of the Gihon spring that lay outside the city. The Siloam inscription, as I said, is in Turkey's Istanbul. It commemorates the moment when the work of two teams of labourers digging with the picks from other ends met with each other. And so there's another extraordinary thing. I don't think they had GPS, satellite technology. They wouldn't have had sounding devices for seismic measurements of all this stuff that we use geologically today to form tunnels. They wouldn't have had any of it. So they started at one end in faith, they started at the other end in faith, and they basically followed a crack in the rock until they got to meet each other in the middle. Whoops. Now, Siloam Pool, there's two Siloam pools today, and they're at different heights. So that picture that I showed you of the pool itself, this is what it was like in the time of Jesus. So this is the excavation. You can see from the picture here how high the soil is today. They've only excavated to the edge of where the pool dropped down inside. And so this was a very large pool. It was very, very large. Here is a model. They have this in Jerusalem, and it's a scale model built of the whole ancient city. So you might remember the schematic diagram. We had the Temple of Jerusalem at the top up here, and then we had that secondary wall that came down for the city of David. There's the old buildings here, so these would have been the old palace of David down here. This is the new outside wall that was built, and here is the scale of the Siloam pool. So you see these massive steps and this very, very deep pool. And so this is deemed to be the size of the pool that we're seeing with Jesus. And so again, it's an extraordinary size. I think I've put another, and so we can see this pool. So I hope that gives you a good picture of what was going on. So we see the actual pictures. It's a real thing. You can go and walk through it today. We have the 3D archaeological picture from Israel that shows where they cut it through, and we understand from the biblical story why they actually cut it through. So this is one of the testaments to King Hezekiah. Part of his story was this great engineering feat. So King Hezekiah consulted with his officials and military staff about redirecting the water from the springs outside the city. The Bible tells us they agreed on a plan. They assembled a large force of men who blocked the naturally flowing stream and used hand picks to chisel a tunnel through the rock to deliver the water into the pool inside the walls. To do this, they tore down numerous houses, as I mentioned, in the city to use the stones to repair broken sections of the existing wall before building defensive towers to sit on the wall. In 2 Chronicles 32, verse 5, it says, they also built another wall outside that one and reinforced the supporting terraces of the city of David. And of course, that is the broad wall, which again you can see in Jerusalem today. So King Hezekiah had many weapons and shields made, appointed military officers, and assembled the city's people in the square of the city gate. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32 again, but verses 7 to 8, so 2 Chronicles chapter 32 verses 7 to 8, he said, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria and the vast army with him, for there is a greater power with us than him. With him is only the arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and fight our battles. Of course, these words heartened his people and they became more confident. And so I'm going to put this next picture, which is a map which I'll refer to of Israel to explain the next steps that took place. So having placed a Babylonian by the name of Belbini on the throne of Babylon as a puppet ruler for the Assyrian Empire, Emperor Sennacherib headed west with his mighty army in 701 BC. This is wonderful because the history is so clear in this time, and we're able to align it to the biblical story and put dates and events to it that are happening around the biblical story as well. So we get to see why they actually came. and how they came. So Hezekiah's preparation of Jerusalem demonstrated his refusal to be intimidated by the Assyrian advance as Emperor Sennacherib marched to Sidon and put their army to the sword. So Sidon, of course, is right up the top here. So we've got Tyre, and then the next city up here, just up here, is called Sidon. So he came across to the Sidonians. This is ancient Phoenicia, which is no longer. And so the first city he came to was Sidon. So that means they came all the way across to the coast and then down this coast road. Luli, the king of Sidon, it says, fled into the sea and breathed his last. So he died. Assyrian records say 8 other kings to their west and numerous others from Phoenicia on the Mediterranean coast to Edom and Philistia in the south submitted to him and offered tribute. So we know that he came down the coast through into this region of Philistia over here, and of course the Edomites further south. It was normal for the Assyrians to replace disloyal vassals with kings who would be loyal. This meant Hezekiah risked losing his throne to another. Even so, he stood his ground as he prepared the city of Jerusalem. After all that Hezekiah had faithfully done to restore the king of Judah to the God of Israel, he was drawn into the conflict, and although not recorded in the Holy Bible, Emperor Sennacherib described in his records how Hezekiah put a king called King Paddy, P-A-D-I, of Ekron in a Jerusalem prison when Philistine nobles and people of Ekron removed him from their throne and put him in chains for swearing his allegiance to Assyria. And so here we have Ekron. It's part of the Philistine territory, so they had this king, and so Hezekiah had him swearing allegiance to his enemy, and so he comes and gets him and puts him in prison back in Jerusalem. So this is not in the Bible, but this is recorded in history. Hezekiah then conducted a successful campaign against the Philistines, who remained loyal to Assyria, and this part is in the Bible. 2 Kings chapter 18 verses 7 to 8. It says, he rebelled against the king of Assyria, so we're talking about Hezekiah, and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. So again, this is the coastal plain. So Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, Ekron, up to this border basically, and Lachish, these region here. This was all part of the Philistia. So he came out and he defeated them. So whilst the king of Assyria is coming out, and he's actually going out and he's taking out all those people who are going to support the king of Assyria. So he probably thinks this will deflate their ability to come against him if he removes enemies from the local region. So when Emperor Sennacherib travelled south, he came to the former territory given to the tribe of Dan. He crossed the Yarkon River and circled a place called Beit Dagon, Jaffa and Beni Barak, and conquered them. So Jaffa we're down to here, Beni Barak is here, and Beit Dagon, so that means the house of Dagon. That's the fish god that we talked about with the Philistines worship. So these locations he came down and he defeated them. Further south, just over the Sorek River, the Philistine people of Ekron were afraid, for they had given their king in chains to Hezekiah in Jerusalem and stopped paying tribute to Assyria. So of course the Assyrians are there now. So what do? They call upon the Cushite pharaoh Tirhakah to come to their aid with an army of bowmen, chariots and horses from Upper Egypt. And so they're expecting them to come racing up this way. Okay? And so I'm going to show you a picture of Pharaoh Tirhakah in next week's lesson. By this time, Hezekiah's neighbours on the other side of the Jordan River, Ammon and Moab, had submitted to the Assyrians. So Ammon is this region, and Moab is all of this region. So we can see here by the colours on the map, they had submitted to them. So his was the only nation in the region left to conquer. So no one else was left, just King Hezekiah, the kingdom of Judah, and his walled city of Jerusalem. So this was now a holy war. The Assyrians believed their gods tasked them to conquer the world, whereas Hezekiah relied on the God of Israel. And that is where we're going to finish tonight. So We've taken you through Hezekiah reinstituted the worship of God in his land. We see how he fortifies his city. We see that he avoids rebellion against the Assyrian and continues to pay his taxes by the historical Ashdod rebellion. We hear about Isaiah the prophet staying in the nude to make sure that nothing happened to him. But then Hezekiah makes a mistake. He sins because he then calls upon help which the Lord said that he wasn't to. And so the consequence of that is the Assyrians come. Why? Because he rebelled. So they're going to come and sort him out. And he's the only people left in the region that has rebelled. And so the might of the Assyrian army has come, and this is the circumstances that we close at today. So next week we're going to have a look at what happens. It'll be the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, and we're going to see what happens when the king of Assyria attacks Judah and Jerusalem. So that brings us to a close today. I hope you've enjoyed tonight's lesson. As we say each lesson, you can watch this again. You're watching it on the Jesus Movement 2000 on Facebook to replay it. All of the lessons are recorded and they will be put onto our YouTube channel, which you can subscribe to. If you type in Paul Brunton, the Jesus Movement, that'll take you there. And of course, we also have all of the videos present on our website, thejesusmovement.com.au. So thank you so much for joining us. God bless you, and we look forward to your company next time.